think you've got that from your father.
I think that's probably true, because I think if anything broke, there was always a minute, have a look at this, see if you could mend it. I mean, you didn't throw things away.
Princess Anne confirms Queen Camilla's expulsion from the palace. Royal family left stunned. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because the meaning behind that headline is far more serious than a simple disagreement inside the royal family. The account unfolding here centers on an alleged palace decision ordering Queen Camilla to leave, after a confidential review reportedly raised questions about restricted correspondence, financial records, and an arrangement connected to privileges for members of her family. And this is what makes the situation different. Queen Camilla was not simply facing criticism from another royal. According to the account, Princess Anne was the one who confirmed that the expulsion order existed, while King Charles was forced into an emergency family confrontation over evidence that appeared to connect the decision directly to his own private authorization. Camilla fiercely opposed the order. She believed she was being targeted, and the room reportedly became tense as the question moved from whether she should leave to something far more disturbing. Why would Charles have authorized such a decision in the first place? Hi viewers. If someone you trusted secretly approved a decision that could take your position away, would you want to know the truth, even if it hurt? Comment yes if you believe Camilla deserved to know everything. The first minutes of the confrontation were not about speeches, accusations, or public statements. They were about a document placed where everyone in the room could see it. Princess Anne had brought the matter forward with the kind of blunt seriousness that made it difficult to dismiss as palace gossip.
And attacked in what way?
On a train.
You were on a train?
On a train.
And someone you didn't know?
Somebody I didn't know. I was reading my book and, this man attacked me, and I did fight back, and I got off. I remember getting off the train and my mother looking at me and saying, why is your hair standing on end? And why is the button missing from your coat?
The alleged order was already there. The issue was no longer whether someone wanted Camilla gone. The issue was whether the machinery of the palace had already moved far enough for anyone to stop it. Camilla reportedly stared at the document as though the words themselves had changed the room. She had expected resistance. She had expected perhaps another private warning, another disagreement over household arrangements, another argument that would eventually disappear behind closed doors. What she was confronting instead was something much colder, a decision. The details surrounding that decision were allegedly tied to a confidential review of correspondence and financial records. That distinction mattered. If the matter had been nothing more than a family quarrel, it could have been dismissed as another private disagreement between powerful personalities. But once records, approvals, financial arrangements, and official privileges entered the picture, the stakes changed. The allegation was that investigators had found evidence suggesting an arrangement intended to secure palace privileges for Camilla's relatives. The precise meaning of those records was disputed. Camilla was said to have rejected the interpretation entirely. From her perspective, protecting people close to her from the consequences of royal life was not the same thing as creating a private extension of royal power. But Princess Anne was reportedly looking at something else. She was looking at the pattern. One request might have been explained. One piece of correspondence could have been dismissed as an administrative draft. One financial entry might have had an innocent explanation. But when several records appeared to point in the same direction, the palace could no longer simply treat each one as an isolated detail. That was when the atmosphere inside the meeting reportedly changed. Camilla wanted to know who had ordered the review. Anne did not immediately answer. Instead, she focused attention on what the review had allegedly uncovered. There were references to privileges. There were questions surrounding access. There were financial details that required explanation. There were communications that appeared to discuss arrangements extending beyond the ordinary needs of a working royal household. And then came the detail that reportedly unsettled everyone. The concern was not simply what had already happened. It was what the arrangement might have been designed to preserve.
I think there were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was an astonishingly wide range of organisations.
You told a reporter at around the time of your 70th birthday that actually if you weren't a princess of the United Kingdom, that actually you might well have been an engineer. Do you think you've got that from your father?
I think that's probably true, because I think if anything broke, there was always a manner, have a look at this, see if you could mend it. I mean, you didn't throw things away.
If the alleged requests had been approved, certain advantages could potentially have continued beyond the immediate circumstances that created them. That possibility raised an uncomfortable question inside the palace. Were these ordinary protections for people connected to the Queen, or were they the beginnings of a structure that could preserve influence long after the circumstances surrounding it had changed? Camilla reportedly rejected the second interpretation. She was said to have insisted that she had spent years carrying the pressure of royal life, and that people close to her had endured scrutiny they never asked for. Any discussion about protecting them, she argued, should not automatically be treated as evidence of a hidden power structure. But the investigators were allegedly not examining motives alone, they were examining records. That distinction made Camilla's position much harder to defend inside the room. Princess Anne reportedly kept returning to the same point. Intentions could be debated, memories could differ, people could disagree over what a conversation meant, but documents created a trail, and somewhere along that trail was the decision that now threatened Camilla's position. The most unsettling part was that the order was not being presented as a sudden emotional reaction. According to the account, it had been authorized privately weeks earlier. That meant the emergency meeting was not necessarily the beginning of the crisis. It may have been the moment when the crisis finally became impossible to hide. King Charles reportedly demanded clarity. He wanted to know exactly what Anne believed the evidence proved. He had publicly stood beside Camilla through years of controversy, and now the woman he had defended was facing an alleged removal order connected to an internal process he apparently knew something about. That moment mattered, because Charles was supposed to be the person with the greatest ability to protect her position. If he had not authorized the order, then who had? If he had authorized it, why? And if he had approved the review without realizing where it would lead, what exactly had he signed? No answer could make the situation simple. Anne then reportedly made it clear that the evidence was not based on a single document. There was a collection of records behind the decision, and the records allegedly raised questions about how palace privileges were being arranged for people connected to Camilla. The Queen's defense was immediate. She had not created some private court, she reportedly argued. She had not ordered anyone to build a rival center of influence. She had not asked for privileges simply because they were relatives. But the question hanging over the room was more difficult. What if the arrangement had been created around her without her fully controlling every detail? That possibility could protect Camilla from one accusation while creating another problem entirely. If she had not authorized the arrangement, who inside her circle had? And why had those people allegedly continued after concerns were raised? Princess Anne reportedly had another document ready. She did not reveal everything at once. That was what made the moment so powerful. The room had already heard about the correspondence. It had already heard about the financial records. It had already heard about the alleged arrangement. Yet Anne was apparently holding back the one detail capable of changing the entire meaning of the confrontation: the authorization. Camilla reportedly believed that if Charles had been confronted with the evidence directly, he would defend her. But the document waiting inside the file suggested something very different. It carried the king's private authorization, not William's, not Anne's, not an anonymous palace official's, Charles's. That single detail transformed the story, because now the question was no longer whether Princess Anne had somehow engineered Camilla's removal. The question became whether Charles himself had already approved the mechanism that could force his wife out of the palace. And that was where the alleged palace crisis became deeply personal. Camilla had spent years believing that whatever disagreements existed around her, Charles would ultimately stand beside her. Yet the document reportedly placed in front of the family suggested that his protection might have had a limit, and that the limit had already been written down before the confrontation began. Charles reportedly looked at the document without immediately speaking. Anne did not need to raise her voice. The evidence was supposed to speak for itself. Camilla looked toward the king, waiting for him to explain the signature, but the answer did not come quickly. And sometimes silence inside a palace can be more revealing than an accusation.
Historic visit, 250 years of our country.
That's extraordinary.
How has your trip been?
Well, it's been whistle stop. It's been really good fun, but we have moved quite fast.
You've been to a lot of places, to quite a few.
We have, but it's been wonderful, and everybody's been very kind and welcoming.
Well,
It's always a pleasure to be here, and always lovely to be back in New York again.
well, we brought you to a place where you would feel at home.
Family had entered the room trying to determine whether Camilla should leave. They were now facing a far more dangerous question. Had Charles secretly authorized her removal before anyone publicly knew that her position was in danger? The next document was still sealed, and according to the account, it contained the detail that could explain why Charles had signed it in the first place. If you believe the public deserves to know what happened behind those closed doors, subscribe now, because staying silent means letting the most important part of this story disappear behind palace doors, and what Anne revealed next made the situation even worse. The sealed attachment was not opened immediately. Princess Anne left it on the table and turned to the financial records instead. That choice mattered. The palace was no longer dealing with one disputed letter or one questionable request. The review had allegedly followed a trail across several records, and the trail appeared to point toward a plan that could have extended privileges beyond the people and duties for which they were originally intended. The first records concerned money. Payments, reimbursements, and proposed arrangements had been examined against the stated purpose of each request. None of the individual entries, on their own, proved wrongdoing. That was precisely why the review had become so difficult. The concern was the accumulation of details. Several transactions appeared connected to requests involving accommodation, access, staffing, or protection for people within Camilla's wider family circle. The distinction was crucial. Royal households routinely deal with expenses and arrangements that ordinary families never encounter. Security has to be organized, staff have to be paid, travel has to be coordinated, residences have to be maintained. The existence of a payment does not prove a secret scheme. What allegedly disturbed the investigators was the purpose attached to some of the requests. Certain arrangements appeared to go beyond immediate royal duties. They seemed designed to provide continuing advantages to people who did not themselves hold formal constitutional roles. If that interpretation was correct, the issue was no longer simply financial. It was about influence. Camilla reportedly rejected that interpretation. She maintained that people close to her had been exposed to public attention because of her position, and that reasonable protections should not automatically be treated as privileges. The argument had force, but the records raised another question that was harder to answer. Who had requested those protections, and who expected them to continue? That question sent investigators deeper into the correspondence. The review allegedly uncovered messages exchanged between members of Camilla's household and palace officials. Some were described as routine. Others contained language that appeared to discuss future access and continuing arrangements. The wording mattered because several requests seemed to assume that existing privileges could survive changes in royal circumstances. That assumption was precisely what concerned the palace. A working royal household exists because there is work to perform. When duties change, the arrangements supporting those duties can change as well. The alleged correspondence appeared to blur that boundary. One request reportedly concerned continued access to a royal residence. Another dealt with staffing. A further proposal raised questions about security and travel. None of these matters was automatically improper. Together, however, they created a picture that investigators believed required a formal explanation, and there was something else. The names appearing around some of the requests were not limited to people performing official duties. They included relatives. That detail reportedly caused the review to widen. The palace could defend resources used for official responsibilities. It could explain security. It could justify staff supporting recognized duties. But when the same machinery appeared to benefit private relatives, every arrangement needed a clear reason. That was the line Anne was reportedly determined to establish. Camilla's position was that the palace was turning ordinary family protection into evidence against her. Her critics, however, could ask a much simpler question. If the arrangements were harmless, why did the correspondence repeatedly raise the possibility of keeping them in place after circumstances changed? That question remained unanswered. Then the review reached a second layer of correspondence. Some messages reportedly referred to future planning rather than immediate needs. The language suggested that certain arrangements should be considered before any public transition occurred. That meant the palace was allegedly being asked to prepare for a future in which Camilla's household might retain forms of access that were normally associated with an active royal role. The timing became important. The requests had reportedly appeared before the emergency meeting. They were not reactions to the expulsion order, they came earlier. That changed the sequence. If the requests had been created after investigators began asking questions, they could have been interpreted as a defensive response. But if they existed beforehand, the palace had to consider whether the disputed arrangements had been planned independently of the later review. The sealed attachment now sitting on the table could potentially answer that. Before Anne opened it, another piece of evidence was examined. A palace advisor reportedly identified a warning that had been sent to Camilla's household. The warning stated, in substance, that privileges connected to an active royal role could not simply be assumed to continue indefinitely. The response to that warning became significant. Instead of ending the requests, the correspondence allegedly changed direction. New options were discussed. Alternative arrangements were considered. The language became more careful. That did not prove that Camilla herself had ordered anyone to bypass palace rules. It did, however, raise a serious question about what her household had been trying to accomplish. If the original route was blocked, why were other routes being explored? And who was directing them? The answer mattered because Camilla had reportedly insisted that she had not personally designed the disputed arrangements. If that was true, the responsibility could shift toward members of her household, but that created another problem. A royal office does not operate without accountability. If officials were making proposals capable of affecting the future structure of the palace, someone had to know what they were doing. Anne reportedly asked for the relevant internal records. The meeting became quieter. The documents showed that concerns had allegedly been raised more than once. The household had received guidance. Questions had been put to officials, yet the proposals continued. Then a date appeared that changed the significance of everything. A further request had reportedly been submitted shortly before the confidential review reached its most serious stage. That suggested the disputed planning had not stopped when concerns were first raised. It had continued. Camilla reportedly argued that the timing proved nothing. Palace offices constantly prepare options. Drafts are revised. Ideas are abandoned. A proposal appearing in a file does not mean a final decision was ever made. Anne did not dispute that principle. Instead, she focused on the pattern. The issue was not whether every draft became policy. The issue was why so many drafts appeared to move in the same direction. More access, more continuity, more protection, more influence, and fewer limits. That was the point at which the financial records became important again. The alleged correspondence had shown what people were requesting. The financial records could show whether any part of those requests had already begun producing practical consequences. The advisors reportedly placed the records beside the correspondence. Dates were compared. Names were matched. Amounts were examined. The picture remained disputed, but it was becoming harder to treat every item as unrelated. Then one entry reportedly drew particular attention. It was linked to an arrangement that appeared to benefit someone connected to Camilla. The amount itself was not necessarily the most important detail. The description attached to it was. It allegedly referred to an arrangement whose continuation had not yet been formally approved. That created a new problem. How could an arrangement be treated as continuing if its future status had not been settled? Camilla reportedly demanded to know whether the palace was suggesting that she had personally authorized the payment. No one made that accusation directly. Instead, Anne reportedly asked a narrower question. Who had authorized it? That question moved responsibility away from speculation about motives and toward the chain of approval. The answer was not immediately given. The records showed officials. They showed correspondence. They showed requests. But somewhere above those layers was a decision maker, and that was where the investigation was heading. because if the person responsible for approving the disputed arrangements was not Camilla, then the palace had to identify who had allowed them to move forward. If it was someone in her household, why had they continued after warnings? If it was someone higher in the palace, why had the arrangements been permitted to develop? And if Charles had known about them, why had he authorized the later action against Camilla? That last question had not yet been answered. It was still waiting inside the sealed attachment. The room had started with a dispute over an alleged expulsion. It was now uncovering a chain of decisions that could involve far more people than anyone had expected. And this time, the evidence would not merely raise suspicion, it would connect the disputed arrangement to a decision made at the highest level of the palace, putting Charles directly in the center of the controversy and changing what the expulsion meant entirely now. The next document was about to identify where that chain led, and anyone who believes this story deserves to be heard should not scroll past now, because staying silent only makes it easier for powerful institutions to bury uncomfortable questions, while the next revelation takes the case somewhere far more serious. The room had gone quiet, but Princess Anne was not finished. The next document was already in her hands, and unlike the financial records, this one could not be dismissed as a routine palace request. It contained a record of an earlier discussion, and its date placed it before the most serious decisions surrounding Camilla's position. Anne opened the file. The document reportedly recorded a private consultation between palace advisors and members of Camilla's household. Its importance came from one question: what would happen if arrangements connected to Camilla continued after the circumstances that created them had changed? That question was not theoretical anymore. The correspondence already examined had raised concerns about continuing access, staffing, accommodation, security, and other privileges. Now the new record appeared to show that palace officials had warned Camilla's representatives that none of those arrangements could simply be assumed to continue indefinitely. The warning was direct. Any future arrangement would need fresh approval. That should have ended the matter. Instead, the records reportedly showed another discussion taking place afterward. The language had changed. Rather than asking whether the existing privileges could continue, officials were allegedly exploring alternative ways of preserving some of the same advantages without describing them as permanent royal privileges. That distinction immediately caught Anne's attention. It suggested that someone understood the restrictions and was still searching for a route around them. Camilla reportedly rejected that interpretation. She could argue that exploring options was not the same as bypassing rules. Palace staff often examined possibilities before any final decision was made. A draft could be abandoned, a proposal could be rejected, a conversation could go nowhere, but one phrase in the record allegedly made the situation harder to explain. The discussion referred to finding another route. That phrase did not prove who had said it, and it did not establish that Camilla had personally approved it. Yet it gave investigators another reason to examine the people around her. The question shifted again. If Camilla had not instructed anyone to preserve those privileges, who had? Anne reportedly asked for the names of the officials involved. The answer pointed towards senior members of Camilla's household. That did not make them guilty of misconduct. It did, however, establish that the disputed planning had reached people close enough to the Queen to understand the consequences of the proposals. Then another record surfaced. This one concerned a meeting held after the first warning. The meeting had allegedly been placed on a private schedule without a detailed public description. No full minutes were available, but a later document appeared to contain language that matched ideas discussed during that meeting. That connection mattered. It suggested that the proposals had not disappeared after the palace raised concerns. They had been revised. Camilla reportedly insisted that she had not been personally involved in every administrative conversation held by her household. That was reasonable on its face. A senior royal cannot personally supervise every message, draft, appointment, or request. But the investigation was no longer trying to determine whether Camilla had typed every word. It was trying to establish whether she knew enough to intervene. That was a much more difficult question. Anne reportedly placed another page on the table. It showed that concerns had been communicated through Camilla's private office. A record indicated that the warning had been received. The exact meaning of that receipt remained open to interpretation, but it weakened any claim that the household had never been informed. Camilla reportedly challenged the implication. Receiving a document did not mean she had read it personally. Reading a warning did not mean she had approved the actions that followed, and an employee acknowledging receipt did not automatically transfer responsibility to the person at the top. Those distinctions mattered. Yet the palace still had to explain why the disputed requests continued after the warning. The answer appeared to be buried in another exchange. Officials had reportedly begun considering whether certain privileges could be described as personal arrangements rather than royal benefits. That was the point at which the issue became more sensitive. A privilege could look very different depending on how it was classified. If it belonged to an official role, it could be reviewed when that role changed. If it was treated as a personal arrangement, it might be argued that it should continue. The investigators allegedly believed that distinction was being used to preserve arrangements that would otherwise expire. Camilla reportedly saw it differently. From her perspective, people connected to her were being exposed to circumstances created by royal life, and reasonable support should not suddenly disappear because palace officials changed the language around it. Both positions had a logical argument, but the records created a problem neither side could easily escape. They showed that the issue had been discussed repeatedly. It had been warned about, it had been revised, and it had continued. That was when Charles's position became increasingly important. He had authority over the palace framework during his reign. If the arrangements were genuinely improper, why had they been allowed to develop as far as they had? If they were acceptable, why had advisors raised warnings? And if Charles had been aware of the concerns, why was Camilla now facing an order that could remove her from the palace? The answers were not yet clear. Then Anne reportedly revealed that the review had reached beyond Camilla's household. Investigators had allegedly examined the approvals connected to the arrangements. They were no longer asking who requested them. They were asking who had permitted them. That search produced a chain of signatures and authorizations. Most were administrative. One was not. The document reportedly carried an authorization from the highest level of the palace, Charles. The discovery did not prove that Charles had ordered Camilla's expulsion. That conclusion would require more evidence. But it showed that the king's authority had entered the story before the emergency meeting ever began. That changed the balance inside the room. Camilla was no longer simply defending herself against Anne's interpretation. Charles now had to explain his own involvement. The king reportedly argued that his approval may have related to the broader review rather than the outcome that followed. A request for investigation was not necessarily an instruction to remove his wife. Authorization of a process was not automatically authorization of its final consequence. That explanation offered Camilla a possible opening. But Anne was reportedly holding one more page. It contained the wording attached to the authorization. And according to the account, that wording did not merely permit officials to examine the disputed arrangements, it gave them authority to determine what should happen if the arrangements were found incompatible with palace rules. That was the moment the room reportedly changed again. The review had not been a passive investigation. It had carried consequences, and those consequences had been authorized before Camilla ever confronted Anne. The Queen reportedly looked toward Charles. For the first time, the argument was no longer about what Anne believed, it was about what Charles had signed. If he had understood the possible outcome, then his public defense of Camilla carried a different meaning. If he had not understood it, then someone had acted under authority he never intended to use against his wife. Either possibility was damaging, and there was still one question no document had answered. Why had Charles signed it weeks earlier? The answer was hidden in the final section of the file, where the investigators had reportedly connected the authorization to the alleged arrangement involving Camilla's relatives. That connection was about to turn a palace dispute into a personal confrontation. Anne returned to the disputed request and compared it with the authorization date. The timing was uncomfortable. The king had approved the review before the final request was resolved, yet the authorization appeared broad enough to allow the palace to act if investigators found a serious conflict. Charles had therefore created a mechanism capable of producing the outcome he was being asked to explain. Camilla reportedly understood the implication. The question was no longer whether someone inside the palace had moved against her. It was whether the king had given that movement his permission without telling her. She reportedly asked for the original authorization, not a copy, not a summary, and not an explanation from an advisor. Anne agreed. The document was brought forward. Beneath the wording was a date that Camilla recognized. It was weeks earlier than she had imagined. That date meant the palace had been preparing for this possibility before the family gathered around the table. The room waited for Charles to speak. He did not, and that silence left one possibility hanging over everyone there. Perhaps the expulsion had never been an accident at all. If you believe this story deserves to be heard before another carefully worded statement buries the questions, stay with it now, because the next part gets worse, and the evidence about Charles's authorization is only the beginning. The signature was already on the page. That was the detail that reportedly stopped the room cold. Princess Anne had not merely produced evidence that Queen Camilla's position was under review. She had placed before the family an authorization carrying King Charles's private approval, dated weeks before the confrontation that had now placed Camilla's future inside the palace in question. But the signature alone was not the worst part. The wording surrounding it allegedly gave palace officials authority to act if the review uncovered arrangements considered incompatible with royal rules. That meant Charles could no longer simply say that he had known about an investigation. The real question was whether he had understood what his authorization could ultimately allow, and that question was about to become personal. Camilla reportedly wanted the original document examined line by line. She was not prepared to accept a summary from advisors. She wanted to know what Charles had signed, when he had signed it, and what he believed he was approving. The answer mattered because the alleged expulsion order had already changed meaning. If Charles had knowingly approved a process capable of removing Camilla from the palace, then his later defense of her appeared deeply contradictory. If he had approved only an investigation, someone else might have pushed that authority further than he intended. That distinction became the center of the confrontation. Charles reportedly maintained that his authorization had been connected to the review itself. He had wanted the concerns examined. He had wanted the palace to establish whether the disputed arrangements were legitimate. He had not, according to the account, expected the process to become a direct order for Camilla to leave. Anne, however, was reportedly not satisfied. She pointed to the language of the authorization. The document allegedly did not stop at ordering an examination. It allowed officials to determine what action should follow if the arrangements were found unacceptable. That meant removal was not an invention made during the emergency meeting. It had been contemplated. Camilla reportedly focused on that distinction immediately. If Charles had not intended her removal, why had the authorization allowed officials to reach that conclusion? Why had she not been told that such an outcome was possible? And why had the matter been handled privately while Charles continued to appear publicly supportive? Those questions created a difficult position for the king. A royal investigation can be confidential for legitimate reasons. Financial records can require privacy. Internal correspondence can be protected while facts are established. But confidentiality becomes much harder to defend when the person at the center of the review may face consequences without knowing the full extent of the process. That was the concern Camilla reportedly raised. She was not simply asking whether she had been accused. She wanted to know whether a decision about her had already been made. Anne reportedly answered with another document. This document concerned the alleged arrangement involving Camilla's relatives. It showed that palace officials had identified specific privileges they believed required reconsideration. The records did not establish by themselves that Camilla had personally ordered those privileges. They did, however, show that the issue had become serious enough to reach senior levels of the palace. The alleged arrangement involved benefits that could include continued access, accommodation, staffing, security, and other forms of support. Each item had its own explanation. The controversy came from the combined effect. The palace was allegedly being asked to preserve a network of advantages around people who did not hold the same official position as the queen. That was the point Anne reportedly emphasized. The question was not whether Camilla's relatives deserved compassion. The question was whether royal resources and privileges could be extended to them simply because of their relationship to her. Camilla reportedly disputed the suggestion that she had sought special treatment. She could argue that family members caught in the royal spotlight required practical support and that palace officials routinely handled complicated arrangements on behalf of senior royals. But the records had created a second problem. Some of the alleged requests appeared to concern the future. They were not limited to immediate security or unavoidable logistical needs. They appeared to anticipate how certain arrangements might continue if Camilla's official circumstances changed. That made the timing more significant. The palace was allegedly discussing continuity before the controversy had become public, and Charles had reportedly authorized the review before the final outcome was known. The king therefore faced two competing explanations. One suggested he had acted to protect the institution. He had allowed an internal process to determine whether questionable arrangements existed, and he had accepted whatever action the investigators considered necessary. The other suggested something more complicated. Charles may have been trying to protect Camilla while simultaneously protecting the monarchy from an arrangement that palace officials believed could create long-term problems. Those two objectives could collide. If they did, Camilla could become the person caught between them. That possibility changed the emotional temperature of the meeting. The issue was no longer simply whether Camilla had done something wrong. It was whether Charles had chosen the institution over his wife before she ever understood the danger. The alleged evidence did not provide a simple answer. That was precisely why the confrontation became so tense. Anne reportedly insisted that she was not asking the family to accept an accusation without evidence. She was asking them to examine the sequence of decisions. First came the disputed requests, then came warnings, then came revised proposals. Then came the confidential review, then came Charles's authorization, and only afterward did the alleged expulsion order emerge. The sequence mattered more than any single document. Camilla reportedly challenged that sequence. She argued that it could be interpreted differently. The review might have been designed to correct administrative problems rather than remove her. The authorization might have been a safeguard rather than a predetermined punishment. The later expulsion order might have resulted from conclusions reached after the king signed. That explanation remained possible, but another detail threatened to undermine it. The authorization reportedly came weeks before the final confrontation, yet the language allegedly anticipated serious consequences if the disputed arrangements were confirmed. Charles had therefore signed, while knowing that the review could produce a decision affecting Camilla's position. That did not prove he wanted her expelled. It did prove that the possibility had entered the process with his approval. For Camilla, that distinction may have offered little comfort. She had not been confronted by an unknown official acting without authority. She was facing a palace process that allegedly carried the king's signature, and now the family had to decide what that signature actually meant. The most uncomfortable possibility was that Charles had approved a mechanism designed to protect the institution, believing that the final decision would never reach his own wife. If that was true, then the king had created a process whose consequences he could not fully control. If it was not true, then the family faced a much darker question. Had Charles known from the beginning that Camilla might ultimately be forced out? No one in the room could answer that yet. Then Anne reportedly turned to the final section of the evidence. There was a second authorization date. It appeared to show that the king had reviewed the matter again after the first concerns were raised. That detail was potentially devastating. It suggested that Charles had not merely signed once and forgotten about the issue. According to the account, the matter had returned to his attention. If he had reconsidered it, what had he learned? What had changed? And why had Camilla apparently remained unaware of the danger? The room reportedly fell silent again. The distinction now carried enormous weight. A signature could authorize a review without demanding an outcome, but a second approval could suggest continued involvement. If the records truly showed that progression, then the family was no longer examining a single decision. It was examining a pattern of choices made behind closed doors, choices that allegedly shaped Camilla's fate before she understood the danger herself at all. Charles now had to explain not one decision, but the sequence behind two. The expulsion order was no longer simply a palace shock. It had become a test of whether the king's private actions matched his public position. Camilla reportedly looked toward him for an answer. Anne waited. And the next piece of evidence was allegedly the one that could determine whether Charles had been protecting his wife, protecting the monarchy, or quietly preparing for the possibility that she would have to leave. That is where the story becomes impossible to dismiss, because the next revelation does not just question what Charles signed. It questions what he knew when he signed it. If you want the truth behind that contradiction exposed instead of allowing it to disappear behind another palace statement, stay here and keep watching, because the next part goes directly to the question Camilla could no longer avoid. The question was no longer whether Queen Camilla would leave the palace. The question was whether King Charles had already decided that she might have to. That distinction changed everything. By this point, the alleged record had created a chain that could not be easily separated. A confidential review had examined correspondence and financial records. Questions had been raised about arrangements connected to Camilla's relatives. Palace officials had reportedly warned that certain privileges could not simply continue. Then Charles had authorized a process capable of producing serious consequences. But there was still one issue that could determine how the entire story should be understood. What exactly did Charles know when he signed? The answer could not be found in the signature alone. It required looking at the timing, the warnings, and the information that had reached the king before the disputed order emerged. According to the account, the second authorization showed that the matter had returned to Charles after the initial concerns were raised. That was significant because it weakened the possibility that his involvement had been limited to a routine administrative approval. He had apparently been brought back into the process. The records reportedly indicated that the disputed arrangements had been reviewed again. The concerns had not disappeared. The alleged requests involving Camilla's relatives remained unresolved, and the palace still faced the question of whether continued privileges could be justified. Charles therefore had a choice. He could allow the matter to continue under existing arrangements, or he could authorize a process capable of changing them. He chose the second path. That did not prove that he wanted Camilla expelled. It did, however, mean that the possibility of a severe outcome had entered a process carrying his authority. Camilla had reportedly believed that the king's public defense of her reflected his private position as well. Yet the documents suggested that, privately, he had been willing to let palace investigators determine whether her position and associated arrangements should continue. Charles could argue that the monarchy could not ignore concerns simply because they involved someone he loved. If palace rules had been stretched, they had to be examined. If financial arrangements were unclear, they had to be reviewed. If privileges had been extended beyond their proper limits, they had to be corrected. But Camilla could make the opposite argument. If she had not personally approved the disputed arrangements, why should she bear the ultimate consequence? The evidence reportedly did not establish that Camilla personally designed every request, approved every payment, or instructed every member of her household. That matters. The records could support questions, but questions are not the same as proof. The same caution applied to Charles. His authorization could show involvement. It could show awareness of a review. It could show that he accepted the possibility of consequences. It could not, by itself, establish what he privately intended. That uncertainty is exactly what made the alleged palace confrontation so explosive. Princess Anne reportedly focused on the institutional consequences rather than the personal emotions. Her position was that once senior officials identified a pattern requiring investigation, the palace could not simply abandon the process because the person affected was the queen. That argument placed the responsibility on the institution. Camilla reportedly saw something else. She saw a process that had been moving around her while she remained unaware of its full implications, and Charles was caught between both positions. If he defended Camilla without addressing the records, he risked appearing to ignore palace standards. If he accepted the findings without challenging them, he risked appearing to approve a decision against his own wife. The alleged expulsion order therefore became a symbol of a much deeper dispute. Who has the final word when royal family, royal privilege, and institutional rules collide? The answer could not simply be Camilla. It could not simply be Anne, and even Charles could not act as though his personal relationship settled every institutional question. That was the uncomfortable conclusion emerging from the records. The controversy also exposed why the alleged arrangement involving Camilla's relatives had become so important. The issue was not merely whether relatives had received assistance. The concern was whether royal status could create a permanent channel of access and protection for people who did not hold official positions. If that had happened, the consequences could extend far beyond one household. It could create expectations for future generations. It could make private family relationships appear to carry institutional privileges, and it could blur the boundary between the monarchy as an institution and the monarchy as a family. That was why the Palace Review reportedly mattered so much. The decision about Camilla was never just about one woman leaving one residence. It was about what the palace was willing to tolerate, what it was willing to investigate, and where it would draw the line. Came the most uncomfortable realization. The alleged expulsion order did not necessarily mean that Anne had defeated Camilla. It may have meant that Charles had created the conditions under which the decision became possible. That is a very different story. Anne could present the evidence, investigators could examine the records, advisors could recommend action, but the authority behind the process allegedly led back to the king. That left Camilla with a question that had no easy answer. Was Charles protecting the monarchy from a problem he believed had become too serious, or had he quietly prepared for her removal and then continued defending her publicly because admitting the truth would have created an even greater crisis? The available account does not settle that question completely, and that uncertainty should not be ignored. A serious story has to separate what the records allegedly show from what people might assume they mean. The documents can create a sequence. They can reveal dates. They can identify approvals. They can expose contradictions. But intention is harder. Only Charles could fully explain what he believed he was authorizing when he signed. And that is precisely why his silence became so important. The final confrontation reportedly left the family facing an uncomfortable choice. Either the authorization had been misunderstood, or the king had knowingly accepted a process that could place Camilla's position at risk. Neither explanation was comfortable. Camilla could challenge the interpretation. Charles could explain the limits of his approval. Anne could insist that the institution had acted according to the evidence available to it, but the documents would remain. And once a private authorization becomes the center of a royal controversy, it becomes difficult to make the controversy disappear simply by refusing to discuss it. That is where the alleged palace expulsion leaves the public, not with a simple villain and a simple victim, but with a chain of decisions that raises uncomfortable questions about loyalty, privilege, accountability, and power. The deepest twist is not simply that Princess Anne reportedly confirmed an order involving Queen Camilla. It is that the order allegedly carried the private authorization of the very man who appeared publicly positioned to defend her. That contradiction is the heart of the story. If Charles intended only to investigate, then the palace must explain how the process moved toward removal. If he understood that removal was possible, then the palace must explain why Camilla was apparently kept outside the full discussion. And if the disputed arrangements were never intended to secure improper privileges for her relatives, then the record should be able to explain why so many concerns gathered around them. Those questions remain the reason this story continues to command attention, because palace controversies rarely end when one document is revealed. They become more difficult when another document changes the meaning of the first, and if another piece of evidence emerges, the entire sequence could be judged differently. For viewers, the most important lesson is simple. Do not accept the loudest claim merely because it is repeated. Look at the dates, look at the decisions, look at who had authority, and look at what happened before the public ever heard about the controversy. If this story made you question the difference between public loyalty and private decisions, do not keep that reaction to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who follows royal affairs, and subscribe if you believe powerful institutions should still face questions when the people involved are among the most protected in the world. Because doing nothing allows unanswered questions to disappear. And if you want to know what happens when the next royal controversy reaches the public, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications now, because the next story coming here is even more troubling, more revealing, and harder to explain.